What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 154. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. The guest today is Connor Freeman. He's a writer at the Libertarian Institute and has been putting out amazing work and follows foreign policy just as close as anyone. And so he's an absolute perfect guest to have on today's show, where we're trying to catch up on some things that have been happening in Israel, Syria, and Iran over the past couple of weeks, but also the big news of the day, what's happening in Afghanistan after a couple of ISIS suicide bombers killed themselves at the gates of the Kabul airport and surrounding area, and killed, I think the latest count as of this recording, Connor, is 60 Afghans and then 13 U.S. soldiers. And so we'll get into more of the details, break all that down, what this possibly means for the U.S. heading forward, and what Biden's speech was in response. But everybody be sure to share the show today. You find it at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of the show. Also, keep your eye on the featured article section of that page for Connor's work. You can also find the show on YouTube, Odyssey, or Rumble. Just wherever you're listening to the show, be sure to hit the subscribe button. That way you don't miss an episode. Give it a thumbs up, rating, and review, whatever you can to help in the algorithm. Give it a share on the social media accounts. We run accounts on MeWe, Facebook, and Twitter. Donate to the show at Patreon or Subscribestar. Crypto info is in the show notes pages, and then you can also support the show and get yourself some great CBD products by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde CBD. You use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, to get 20% off when you check out order $75 or more. They have a great lineup of products at Paloma Verde. I really like their topicals. I use their sports cream almost every day. It works within 10 minutes, I would say, and it doesn't take very much. And so, I actually find I'm saving some money over like alternative products that you would get at Walgreens by using the Paloma Verde sports cream. So check out their great lineup of products over there. They have different topicals. They have Edstrat, soft gels, even stuff for your dog. Just be sure to use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, when you check out. That gets you a discount and helps the show get a discount. All right, Connor, let's get into it. And we'll start off here with what happened today. Will Porter, a typical co-host, has a great thread on Twitter that I will link to in the show notes page. And Connor, let's just, I guess, generally what happened early morning U.S. time, which I think equated to like maybe afternoon, evening in Afghanistan. Two people who were later at least claimed by the Islamic State Khorasan affiliate that exists in Afghanistan claimed that they were of ISIS-K, and went and blew themselves up near the Kabul embassy, or not embassy, airport, and then at the gates of the Kabul airport, killing at least 60 Afghans and 13 U.S. soldiers. Again, this is as of the recording. I would expect with the numbers that have been giving in the number of injuries, that I think the U.S. was reporting in the double digits and then triple digits for Afghan civilians, that these numbers are going to continue to go up. The Biden administration came out and pretty quickly said that, hey, this attack doesn't have anything to do with the Taliban, and that they didn't allow this to happen, that they weren't behind it. And then the Taliban blamed ISIS-K, and ISIS-K came out and took responsibility. So Connor, fill in the rest of the details. What's going on here?
Yeah, so essentially we saw this. I mean, the withdrawal was going in the last few days. The Taliban had essentially announced that in fact the August 31st deadline, which was at this point, I guess, the third deadline for the withdrawal. Originally it was supposed to be May 1st. Biden pushed it to September 11th in late April, and then it was brought back to August 31st. But of course, at the beginning of August, the Taliban swept the country from the first provincial capital going down. 11 days later, Kabul fell, I believe, last Sunday. And so Now we saw demands that we saw demands from the Europeans, as well as a lot of the hawks, for the U.S. to, it was a humiliating defeat, and that we needed to. Excuse me, I misspoke. It was this was the weekend before last. But since then, we've seen the Hawks come out in full force, saying this is a humiliation and that we need to, there's different things we can do. I think Paul Wolfowitz was out there saying we need to form some sort of an underground railroad, like a covert operations deal with the military, intelligence, coordinating with the military to get Afghans and other people out. And the Europeans and like Boris Johnson, for instance, and the Wall Street Journal editorial board, everybody was demanding Biden needs to stay and blow past this deadline, particularly after the Taliban, once they got wind of all of this, because the withdrawal was going about as smoothly as it could under the circumstances, although it still was essentially a debacle. I mean, people were living in horrible conditions outside the airport. I mean, the pictures coming out were just horrendous. People, with trash all over the place and no bathrooms, and people getting dehydrated and handing over their children to soldiers who then kind of use that for advantageous exploitative photo ops and different things for the military's purposes. But once the Taliban started saying, actually, no, we're going to hold you to this deadline, and it's a red line. If you don't leave by the 31st, you'll be viewed as invaders. It seems to me that there was a connection there, because then the airlift started becoming much more efficient. We started seeing, I think it was Monday was up to that point, the biggest airlift yet. And I think in 12 hours, they had gotten more than 10,000 or somewhere approximating like 11,000 people out of the country. And since then, we've seen, I think Blinken said yesterday that they've evacuated more than 82,000 people at this point. And they were discussing that between Tuesday and Wednesday, they had nearly 20,000 people evacuated on 90 U.S. military and coalition flights. So things were picking up, and Biden held strong, even though he was being pushed, like I said, in every direction to stay, which would have, of course, provoked a reaction on the part of the Taliban. So that was, a dangerous situation, but like we said, he held strong and did not cow to the war party, and so he told the G7 on Tuesday that no, I'm actually gonna leave on the 31st. And so Boris Johnson, who was leading the charge, the British were the most pressed him the hardest. They announced that essentially they'd be done with their evacuation mission in the next 24 to 36 hours. They said that on Tuesday, and that they would have their troops out by Friday or Saturday. The Germans said they'd be done in a few days. The French said that they would be done today, actually, with their evacuation mission. So things look to be expediting. But then we saw this morning that there had been a major attack from ISIS, and like you said, the casualties we don't know them all exactly yet. But I think this was, I mean, you and I were speculating this morning before ISIS claimed credit for the attack. And actually, it was encouraging to see, because, it could have been some rogue Taliban guys, we thought, maybe, taking a last act of revenge. But at the same time, I didn't think the leadership I didn't think there was like an institutional incentive for them to provoke a reaction from the Americans, because it would, of course, be, if the Taliban really did do this attack, then that the Americans would have stayed, and there would have been, at that point,
right.
It's anybody's guess exactly what would have happened.
There's just a lot of people in Afghanistan who hate the Americans, and the U.S. has carried out a lot of war crimes against the Taliban. So I think it was impossible that it was just some rogue actors within the Taliban, or just Afghans, who knows, or even just somebody who's in Afghanistan who saw this as an opportunity. Connor, one thing I just wanted to hit on was that, and this is something that Will pointed out on the show earlier in the week, and I actually talked about in the last show, was that there had been State Department warnings, and actually they had talked about clearing certain areas outside of the Kabul airport, and I believe the U.S. and other Western partners advised advise their citizens not to go to these areas. And you could actually find in this CNN article where they talk about, be careful of the gates outside of the Kabul airport. So it seems like they had somewhat specific intel that this attack was either being planned or likely to happen, and somebody was unable to respond to it anyways. But it's pretty interesting what's going on here. So go ahead, pick up
Well, Sullivan, yeah, you're absolutely. I mean, Sullivan was coming out, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and was for days now has been saying that the primary threat is ISIS-K. It's a very real threat. They all said different variations of that phrase. I think even McKenzie said something to that, something approximating that today. We're doing everything we can, trying to find the exact quote. But anyway, he was saying basically that they're coordinating with the Taliban to essentially to prevent such to attend to this extremely, I think he said like extremely real threat or something like that.
Well, maybe this is one quick place to jump off and talk about something that I've been seeing, because people are suddenly all appalled that the U.S. would, for whatever reason, work with the Taliban against ISIS-K. This seems like, we're working with the enemy. Yeah. And how crazy this is. The Warhawks are absolutely in hysterics about it. And yet it's been going on for well over a year, and nobody seemed to care for most of the time when the U.S. was backing the Taliban with airstrikes against ISIS-K. I have this article here from the Washington Post from, I think it was 2020.
I think it was late last year. A group of Joint Special Operations Command were carrying out airstrikes, I think, in Kunar province in northeastern Afghanistan. And they had indirect, but pretty, it seems like fruitful alliance with the Taliban. I mean, they even had a plaque at their headquarters called Taliban Air Force, or that said Taliban Air Force. And so I don't think I think if I remember correctly, they weren't communicating directly, but it became obvious to the Taliban that when they would go in for these attacks on ISIS-K, there would be drones and missile strikes, airstrikes against these targets. And it got to the point where they expected it and they were happy to take the assistance, and they would move in once they saw the strikes occurring.
Yeah, this is from October of 2020. In the Washington Post. And so it's very interesting that you basically have all these people who kind of out themselves as Afghan novices by the fact that they're suddenly outraged that the U.S. would be working with the Taliban when it was obviously going on. And, far more, I think, far more in an optional way before, right? We didn't have to bat the Taliban with these airstrikes. In fact, you could also imagine a Pentagon strategy where they kind of say, Connor, well, these are enemies killing each other, and so let's just let them kill each other a little bit more. It doesn't seem like a bad deal, but they specifically recognize that the Islamic State Khorasan faction was a worse group. One I think thing worth pointing out about this too, Connor, is what the Afghan ISIS faction it actually is and isn't, because there's a lot of people who seem very confused about this. There's a pretty good article by Anshul Levine today in Responsible Statecraft on, but what I really have to recommend people read is the Afghan Analyst Network. It's I think Afghan-Analyst, and then the Islamic State in Khorasan, how it began and where it stands now in Nangarhar. And so this is, from 2016, and there's obviously been some things that have changed about ISIS-K since then. I think they've, obviously lost some territory as the U.S. bat the Taliban against them, but it's a fantastic overview of, where this group came from. And essentially, in the Obama administration, when they're really at the height of the drone war, they're carrying out a lot of drone strikes in Pakistan, and not only were they targeting people that maybe the Americans would think of as terrorists, but I think they're just helping the Pakistanis wage a war, a drone war, and a war in general, because they have forces on the ground against this Tehrik-e Taliban group that eventually flees over the border into Afghanistan. Now, there's some reporting from the time that I find pretty credible that the Afghan government, well, first of all, if you have refugees in your country, it may make sense that they receive government support. So that may be a part of this. But, as the Trinky Taliban come into Afghanistan, they receive support from the Afghan government. And some of that support may have even come as they saw them as effective force against the Taliban. But for whatever reason, you have the Trinky Taliban who end up settling in Nangarhar, Afghanistan, and then picking up the jihad fight and becoming the Islamic State Khorasan faction. Now, they haven't seemed in any way really resembling the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They haven't set people on fire as far as I could tell. Now, they have been more brutal than the Taliban. That's worth pointing out, that they have attacked targets like in Kabul, girls' schools, Hazara schools. I think early on, in 2017, there was an attack on a sports game. I think it was football, but soccer, but it may have been cricket. And the Taliban were like, "Oh no, we would never attack a sports game. This isn't something we do." And so, in some ways, this was a group that was a little bit worse in hitting those soft civilian targets than the Taliban. And eventually, they become a real problem for the Afghan government, and the U.S. Raids special forces operations against them. But it seems like by 2020 they kind of decided that the best option was just to watch what the Taliban are doing in Nangarhar, and when they have the opportunity, blow up the ISIS-K guys for the Taliban. And that I think is more or less ISIS-K and why they had the relationship they do with the U.S. and with the Taliban. And so I actually named one of the last clips on the show, Connor. The Taliban are America's anti-ISIS force in Afghanistan, and that has more or less been how it's played out. And so right now you have a situation in Kabul where Taliban control everything in Afghanistan, I guess, except the Panjshir Valley and whatever ISIS-K, wherever they're holed up, is the territory that's not held by the Taliban in the Kabul airport. And so the U.S. has to coordinate with the Taliban. We know William Burns was in Afghanistan earlier in the week and actually met with Baradar. Not sure what they talked about. I believe there were even reports that the Taliban warned the U.S. About a possible Islamic State Khorasan attack, although it seems like a lot of people had read this red flag early on. Again, we see in the CNN article that they were fairly specific and fairly close to what actually happened in this attack. So, Connor, I'll let you pick it up from there, though.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's interesting is the hype of this is being used to sort of, it's interesting that this happened because, for people who know that context, when you and I heard about this attack this morning, we assumed it was this group most likely. I mean, given the coordinated nature, and I was thinking well, whoever did this wants there to be some sort of a conflict likely between the U.S. and the Taliban, because and that's interesting that the Taliban had warned the U.S. Of course, they tried to warn the U.S. Notably about 9/11, sending their foreign minister months in advance after they were tipped off by an Uzbek jihadist sort of informant that they knew there was an impending attack on the U.S. There's no evidence that they knew the details, but they went to the American embassy in Peshawar, Pakistan, and the UN to warn the Americans of what may be coming. And so yeah, I mean, and the Taliban they didn't want to. They're trying to consolidate control. They already, they have basically, like you said, everything except for the Panjshir Valley, and they've still got to deal with this ISIS Khorasan group. One of the things that we keep seeing in reports and from a lot of the hawks is they're conflating ISIS now, of course, with Al Qaeda, and they use those terms kind of interchangeably. And so they'll talk about how, well, when the Taliban was taking back these provinces and these provincial capitals, they would, free people from these prisons, a lot of Taliban prisoners in these prisons. And that could have been part of surrender deals and these sorts of things. But, the issue is, of course, there are ISIS members in those prisons as well. So that's being spun as that there's some kind of, alliance. John Bolton, and you see a lot of the hawks on Fox News and in mainstream media, they talk about it like these groups are allies. But of course, they're not. And so, it basically the the line is that, well, the Taliban is great. You see this from a lot of the neocons. The Bolton called it, they're turning Afghanistan back into a privileged sanctuary for terrorists to attack America, to attack their allies and our friends. And actually, Dan Crenshaw, the congressman, was on Fox News today, and he was talking about how there was sort of a perverse sort of inversion of what's actually going on the ground, because the Fox News lady who was interviewing him goes, I guess she goes, and there's all these groups, and she goes, and they all seem to have a common interest in killing Americans. She goes, I guess when it comes to killing Americans, it's sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. And Crenshaw was just like, oh yeah, absolutely. And he was talking about we need to go back in and take the Kandahar airfield and take Bagram back. And they all keep saying this stuff. I sent you a couple videos of like Jocko Willink and what's his name, Marcus Littell, the guy who Lone Survivor is based on. All these sort of former military grifter types. They keep going on and saying, we can do it, we can go back in. But like, I mean, it's just disgusting, because this is, we just had a new report from Cost of War come out that said that more than 240,000 people were killed in Afghanistan and Pakistan, like you were just talking about Obama's drone war, and terrorist sanctuary. ISIS is a result anyway of U.S. foreign policy, especially, Bush and Obama in Iraq and Syria. And this group is a result of the drone war in Pakistan. And of course, I think the Taliban has an interest in making sure, especially with their relationship with China and Russia, to ensure, because that's been the main concern of the Russians. The Chinese want them to clamp down on the East Turkestan Islamic group. What is it? The East Turkestan, is it the Front? East Turkestan Islamic Front? Anyway, that's the sort of the Uyghur terrorist group in I think it's Badakhshan province in the very northeast, sort of the panhandle area of Afghanistan that borders Xinjiang province of China and Tajikistan. And, the Russians' primary concern, they were doing drills a week or two ago with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, preparing for, contingencies of, the conflict spilling over the northern borders there. And so the Taliban have want to make sure that these states know, these surrounding neighboring states are aware that they will not allow attacks to go, be launched from Afghan soil. And when the Americans were panicking after the fall of Kabul and they evacuated the embassy, and the Europeans were panicking, the Russians notably came out and said, we don't see a reason to evacuate our embassy. And they said, we think that we've looked at, the early impressions are that security will be much better under the Taliban than it was under the Ghani government. And so whoever was doing this attack, I think it was intended to put the Taliban in a very tough spot, where either the Americans would seek revenge, although it looks like, Biden came out and said he's not going to attack. Well, he said he's not going to extend the withdrawal, but he did say that we'll come back essentially and take retribution to the forces that attacked us today. And as Dave DeCamp pointed out on Twitter, they'll probably just bomb some godforsaken Afghan village to bits and then call it a day or something.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, the situation as it is, I think. It'll be interesting to see where the Hawks take this, but I think things seem to be calming down because of the coordination between the U.S. and the Taliban. But that's absolutely true what you said, that is being used to sort of batter the American people and the Biden administration as being sort of weak and feckless. A lot of the early reactions we saw were people without evidence blaming this attack on the Taliban and saying, I guess this is a reasonable price to pay as far as the Biden administration is concerned, that we, lose, that Americans are killed at the hands of the Taliban, or people saying, Biden got played by the Taliban. But I think that coordination and Biden's, steadfastness in wanting to end this war, or at least our intervention in it for the most part at this point, is what's, preventing any kind of escalation, which I think whoever did this, of course, and the Hawks, who have common interests, wanted to see.
Yeah. So Connor, just a couple things, and then you kind of hit on there, but I just want to elaborate on. I've seen this tweet from Marcy Wheeler saying that Donald Trump was such a chump that he took the Taliban's word that they wouldn't harbor terrorists anymore, and so I'm kind of seeing that some people are saying that this is a violation of the agreement with the Taliban because either they harbored the terrorist or other people are saying that they're just unable to control the terrorist. And so that's proof that we need a state because we can't leave it up to the Taliban, which is absolutely absurd. There's been ISIS-K in Afghanistan all along. They've been carrying out far more brutal terrorist attacks than that have happened here. Attacks targeting schools. And, as sad as it is that American soldiers are dying, little girls who are trying to go to school getting blown to pieces is probably like the worst kind of attack that you could imagine, right? Like, it's just the most horrific thing that can. And these were happening when we had thousands of American soldiers in, when we controlled the country. This isn't like a unique Taliban problem that suddenly there's ISIS terrorist attacks and ISIS problems in Afghanistan because the Taliban are in charge. So that's a completely ridiculous myth. There's a lot of people like Lindsey Graham, and I'm guessing he's partnered up with Jack Keane as usual, saying that what we need to do is retake the Bagram Air Base, and then we need to punish Afghanistan for allowing this to happen. This Fox News host says, "My anger is only equated by sadness. I pray for their souls, and I pray for my brothers those hungry war dogs, I pray they eat." And so I saw people, who's Todd Starnes said, "For every American who is killed, a city in Afghanistan should be wiped from the earth." I mean, these are people are advocating for genocide right now, essentially. They're talking about wiping out towns. Men, women, children, doesn't matter. The most horrific kind of war crimes. 9/11 scale attacks where they want to commit across Afghanistan because some Americans were killed by a group of people that largely aren't from Afghanistan. I mean, these are people largely from Taliban. Maybe they include like some really radical Taliban guys that are upset that the Taliban aren't extreme enough anymore. Maybe they include some like ISIS fighters from Iraq and Syria who were left with nowhere to go. Maybe some of the Uyghurs who fought with ISIS in Syria when that fell apart, they ended up there. But for the large part, it's these Pakistani Taliban, right? And it's just, that they're willing to exact all their revenge on Taliban. And essentially, it's just a giant punching bag for the United States. And every time we get mad, we're going to go and bomb the hell out of Afghanistan. That's what people want to happen.
That's how we got into this.
It's all over. Yeah, it's, an absolute repeat of what happened on 9/11. But, this is all over Fox News. It's all over Twitter. Of course, these people never run into any consequences for advocating murdering innocent children. Of course, you say anything about what Israel's doing and the resistance to them, and then suddenly you're supporting extremism. Or if you say anything not negative about the 1/6 event, then you're supporting extremism. But here you could support killing entire towns, cities in Afghanistan, and that's just like the normal political discourse in the United States, and that's fine, and nobody has any problems with that. Yeah, patriotic. Don't you know he just loves America so damn much and all those soldiers that he wants to commit atrocities in their name. So I don't know, Connor. I think that's like most of what I had for Afghanistan. I think I think we dispelled most of the myths that are going on around, particularly what happened with the Islamic State Khorasan faction and their ties to the Taliban. The last thing I just want to mention is I see a lot of particularly Republican hawks who are making this point. Oh my God, I can't believe the U.S. is negotiating with the Taliban. Isn't this so terrible to engage in diplomacy with the terrorist group? And I have to say, if there's one thing that a part of the Biden withdrawal that they should really be commended on, is they seem to have figured out a way to work with a group that the United States has been at war at for 20 years where there hasn't been, I don't know if there's been a shot fired between the US and the Taliban in Kabul so far. I mean, this is quite stunning that they've been able to negotiate that. Also, gotta give credit, and it's not like me and Connor are ever the guys that are like, let's talk about how much we love Joe Biden. But let's just say that I am shocked as hell that this feeble, seemingly mushy-minded old man has stood his ground and has, kind of just said hell no to all of this. He's done exactly what you, as a Democrat, you would need to do. You need to leverage your military and the Pentagon, and you need to say that, look, my Pentagon's saying we want to go, so we're going. This is the only option that we have. Now, he has said some things in his speeches that I don't agree with, and I think are wrong. But the fact that we're leaving and that he isn't saying that, okay, after this, we're just going to carpet bomb the area surrounding the Kabul airport, which there's a lot of people who are not that far from real positions of power in the United States are calling for that. So, give it to Joe Biden there.
Yeah, I think what is happening, what's really interesting about this moment is, I think you were using the term on a recent show, it's this Afghanistan Syndrome, and that keeps coming up more. And it's, I think there's one way, I think the American people are hopefully realizing, although they're reacting to it in strange ways, we've seen a really intense narrative management campaign in the media and even in the independent media, kind of, interestingly, people who you'd expect to have more nuanced takes kind of latching onto the partisan aspects of this and really attacking Biden. And, we're seeing all this sort of impeach Biden rhetoric. But it's really interesting. I mean, I think what we're seeing is a recognition that the American people, I always think, they find it much easier to hate somebody else as opposed to the entity that is really truly exploiting them and abusing them. We already discussed, the civilian casualties, the fact that we were looted of more than $2 trillion for 20 years and hundreds of thousands of people have been slaughtered, probably more because those numbers don't even account for the indirect deaths and the excess deaths due to, lack of nutrition and damage to infrastructure and disease.
And the things that we have learned since too, just like, there's this video, the Australian Special Forces, they just walked through a field and murdered some guy. You think that all those deaths actually got counted, or they just murdered people and left them in like sewer ditches, or claimed they were Taliban, or just bury them in a shallow grave, and that was that.
Yeah, just tons of war crimes. Drone strikes on the wrong houses, the bombing of hospitals, the famous incident a couple years ago when those pine nut farmers were bombed by the dozens and dozens. It's just horrendous. And then, even soldiers getting frustrated with the situation on the ground and then just going out on killing sprees. We saw that quite a bit during the surge, during Obama's surge. Again, it's interesting too, like, they hate Biden because, I honestly think a lot of the hawks were hoping something like this would happen so that they could exploit it and run with it, because the whole idea, it's so funny. Nikki Haley was saying like a week ago on Fox News, she was going, this is the worst case scenario of anything that could, and no Americans had died. The Taliban took power in a coup de main. If you really break it down, the idea is like, well, it's, they took the country back. There wasn't even a huge war for a few years between our propped up Afghan government that we were going to pour billions of dollars into each year, and that we were going to arm and make a lot more money for the military industrial complex, and hopefully these guys could beat each other's brains out. And who knows how many tens of thousands of people would have been killed, and probably millions more displaced. Like, that would have been the non-catastrophic outcome. So I think a lot of this is they're determined to, I think there's a lot of bruised pride in this. So we're seeing like Condoleezza Rice coming out and demanding, like, we need to now is the time, we need to strengthen our commitments to Ukraine and Iraq, and particularly Taiwan, and all this stuff from people like Richard Haas and Brett Stevens going, well, it was a sustainable status quo. And I love how there's the safe haven myth. I love how Daniel Larison is calling it the sustainable status quo, the myth of the sustainable status quo, because there wasn't this whole idea. They're so cynical with the way they go, like, look, there were no casualties in the last year or so. But of course, it's because of the deal that Trump made and the fact that Biden is actually following through on it, which they did not want him to do. And quite honestly, I didn't think he was going to until very recently, honestly. He waited until April to make the decision. And, I mean, when they had that whole embassy command idea that we're going to have an advise and assist mission, and we saw reports that looked like British special forces were going to stay there and the Turks were going to stay and basically build like a NATO fortress at the airport. Those things they were okay with. They were okay with the surge, putting with the Europeans and the Americans and the contractors a 250,000-man army, hundreds of billions of dollars spent, tens of thousands of casualties. And I think look, thousands of Americans have died in this war, but they're really mad at Biden because he's ending it. So it doesn't even have anything to do, at least from the Hawks' point of view, about American casualties. They're just going to use that if they can to stir up the American population who, instead of focusing on the mass theft and mass murder that their government is committed on at their direct expense, and now a lot of these people don't have their son or daughter at home anymore, that they're going to be mad that, these Americans we got to go in there and get revenge. So, but it looks like they're not going to, like you said, I think this is the one issue, because it doesn't look like Biden will probably return to the Iran deal, although it's putatively understood that he will at some point. He said he was going to end the war in Yemen. Of course, he's not. We still maintain Saudi warplanes through the foreign military sales program, and the tensions have increased with China and Russia. But this is the one thing that Biden has done that is in fact commendable. And it's also ironically better kind of this way that the Taliban, did what it did, because now to think of what would have happened had the U.S. been able to maintain that militarized embassy and airport. They don't just hang out there with all their weapons and all the money coming in. They would have, the idea would have been, well, we can prop up the Afghan army through here, and they even said we're going to be running counterterrorism missions, and so it's a good thing, I think, ultimately the way this is working out. Although of course not what happened today, and again, you could blame the Americans ultimately for what happened today, because a lot of these people were standing knee deep in a wastewater canal because this has been managed so poorly. And Doug Bandow has been writing about how if they had expedited the broken visa process and Biden had, if he since he really did want to do this, I think the Pentagon and the State Department was standing in his way and pressuring him, and they honestly didn't think, and I don't even think the Europeans believed that this withdrawal would actually happen. I think we're seeing something very unique here. But yeah, he should have been working on this long before, but under the circumstances, you got to give him props on this one thing.
Yeah, so all great points, Connor. We should move on and start talking about some other stuff here. We could go back and forth on Afghanistan all day and just go over all the terrible hot talking points and everything. It's just so clear that either these people are absolute sociopaths and who really understand what they're doing, and that their goal is to create war for the military-industrial complex, and that they just don't care about the lives of Afghans. Dave DeCamp pointed out the article from Defense One didn't even mention that 60 Afghans had died in the attack, and so these just aren't lives that matter to them. Or two, you got all these drive-by idiots, and that's where I put like the Nikki Haley's of the world, who have no idea what the hell they're talking about on Afghanistan, and suddenly have shown up and are trying to tell people, what their business should be and how things are in Afghanistan. It's just clear that they can't tell Al Qaeda from ISIS, from the Taliban, from ISIS-K, from any other. They're just like, well, it's somewhere between China and Israel, so we assume they kind of all look alike and that they'll blow themselves up, when on command for the jihad and everything. But let's talk about Israel, Connor, where The Israeli people are being or not the Israeli people, the Palestinians are being terrorized by the Israeli government and the IDF. We have just some horrific stories to get into: a 15-year-old Palestinian boy killed in the West Bank, and then these clashes during protest in Gaza. But let's go ahead and start with what's happening in the West Bank, Connor, and some of the Israeli killings there.
Yeah, so we'll start with the 15-year-old boy who was killed. This is a report out of Al Jazeera from this week. Ahmad Khalid Salah Hashash, a 15-year-old, was killed in a refugee camp, the Balata refugee camp in the in the West Bank near Nablus, and which is sort of in the northern part of the West Bank. And yeah, it was an overnight operation. They're apprehending a suspect. These night raids that just go, they seem to be ramping up, but they're a constant occurrence. The boy was, they come in the middle of the night with their forces, and this boy was standing on top of the roof of of one of the houses, and the Israeli forces claimed that a riot was started. And that people were throwing things like cement blocks and different objects from the roof. And their story is that they turned around and fired at a guy who was holding something up on the roof. And it turned out to be this 15-year-old boy who they shot in the head. And it's just been brutal because we're seeing more and more of these raids. There was another instance where 4 Palestinians in their late teens and early 20s were murdered in the Jenin refugee camp in the northern part of the West Bank, and this was last week, where you had undercover units going in there in the very early morning, pre-dawn, and they shot 8 Palestinians. Again, it's always under the idea that they're going in there. Well, these are like night raids, so they go in and they arrest somebody. And of course, there's a very, it's a Orwellian legal system that the conviction rate is it's over 90%. And they go in and they shot these, they shot 8 people, and 2 of them were Raed Abu Saif, who's 21, Salah Ammar, who's 20. He was evacuated to the Jenin Governmental Hospital. And then there were 2 other young men, Nuar Eldin Abdullah Jarar, is 19, and Amjad Ayad Amzi Husseini, who is also 19. And their bodies, the Israelis do this quite often. Their bodies were, they prevented medical. They prevented ambulances from reaching these guys, and then they took their bodies and they've detained them, and they're not returning them. And that's another thing that happens often. And they also arrested another guy in the camp during the raid. So apparently in this case, we had eyewitness reports that were taken from Middle East Eye that said that the snipers were on the roof in this case, Israeli snipers, and that they were shooting at people from the roofs. And one of these young men actually had a gun and fired back. So they shot him. He fell to the ground, and then they essentially, it says, heavily fired into him until he was dead. And one of his friends, allegedly Husseini, attempted to grab him and pull him away, and they shot and murdered that young man as well. So there's some shocking statistics that are included in this article. So according to the UN Office of Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs, there have been more than 2,500 these arrest raids in the West Bank since the beginning of the year. And just from July 27th to August 9th, Israeli forces have carried out 92 raids across the West Bank, arresting 115 Palestinians, including 11 children. And they've reported they've injured 764 Palestinians in the West Bank just in that time period, 4 of whom were killed. Last month they murdered an 11-year-old boy getting groceries with his family, a young boy with his father in their, I think it was a van they were in. And then when the funeral was held, they came back and murdered somebody else at the funeral. It's just, it's incredible. It's another thing. 55 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank so far this year, and more than 12,000 have been injured. So, and that's not even including what's going on in Gaza. So we're seeing a ramping up of violence under the Bennett government, and we're seeing, Bennett's going to speak, or he was supposed to speak with He's supposed to speak with Biden today. But last I read, that meeting got canceled. But he's indicated that he is not seeking any peace talks with the Palestinians and will continue to expand the illegal settlements. They just announced thousands more houses that will be built in Area C. And it's just, it's just devastating. And the Biden administration has expressed that they don't want to see any more of the settlements, although I feel like every Democratic administration tries to do that to some extent. Trump was a unique situation, essentially giving Israel everything they wanted. But in a lot of these cases, we see these different policies have not been rolled back. Recognizing the capital as Jerusalem, the American embassy being in Jerusalem as well, being moved to Jerusalem as well. In fact, we've seen there was a piece I read at Electronic Intifada the other day about how the State Department has essentially taken the line that the Golan Heights is Israel. It's very interesting to see how there's so much continuity of the policy.
Yeah, well, not just of the continuity, but escalation, and Biden is endorsing all the escalation. That's the really crazy thing here. It's not like he's like it's continuing just from Obama to Trump to Biden. It's escalating from Obama to Trump to Biden. So yeah, this is just crazy what's happening in the West Bank, but it doesn't even really compare to what's happening in Gaza, where the situation is so terrible that you have, Israeli snipers open fire on Palestinian protesting in Gaza as a regular, almost they use live ammunition like U.S. police use mace, like that liberally, and even against young targets and stuff like that. And so there were some recent protests going on in Gaza, Connor, from what I've been able to come up with. And if you just read the Western press, I guess the big highlight here is that an Israeli soldier ended up being critically injured. So I'm guessing, just from reading the press, that this was like a Hamas thing where, they terrorized the poor Israeli soldier just trying to keep order, or what happened here?
Yeah, there's been an uptick in cross-border violence between Gaza and Israel, but essentially that's, since the last assault on Gaza back in May, there's been a sort of fragile ceasefire agreement that was brokered by Egypt. And, Israel has continued to still, launch airstrikes in Gaza. And so we'll see things where I guess what I'm picking up is that the first rocket attack into Israel was just days before these protests on Saturday. And so that's pretty interesting because there have been, several airstrikes from the Israelis onto Gaza. But it does look like now, there were these protests on Saturday because the siege has still not been lifted. Only recently did the Qataris resume aid it's like aid payments to Gaza, which is, something that was, it was one of the main demands. It was canceled in May over the violence going on between Gaza and Israel. And what we're seeing now is that these protests are coming. They want to draw more attention, just like under the Great March of Return, from the international community. To show what's going on, because essentially they're helpless. They're blockade. They're under total blockade, and so we saw last Saturday there were these protests. Thousands of people came out, and 40 people, more than 40 people, I think, were injured, shot with, like you said, live ammo, tear gas, the rubber-coated steel bullets. 24 children were wounded. And in fact, some of this is in more the northern part of Gaza. We saw some footage on the eastern border that some of these Gazans actually got pretty close to the wall, closer than I've seen in footage before. And there was an Israeli sniper just taking shots at people through a hole in the wall. And somebody actually, a young Palestinian, was able to get in there with a handgun and shot the sniper and injured him. He shot him in the head. He didn't die. A 13-year-old boy was critically injured as well during these protests from the Israeli side. They shot a 13-year-old Palestinian on the other side of the wall. But
So just so we could get clarity on the real story here, Connor, and just summarize it real well, because again, this isn't the narrative that you get from the corporate press. You had an Israeli sniper behind a barricade opening fire on protesters, and then a Palestinian stopped that guy from killing children. It seems generally like an accurate description of it.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm sure, you could think about the way it would be described in the U.S. press if some guy with a long rifle started opening fire on a bunch of protesters and then somebody else walked up and stopped that guy from doing that. I don't want to get into all the details of how that would maybe be portrayed because, people accuse you of glorifying certain things, but, just to understand how events played out here and what actually happened. It's not like, oh, those damn Palestinians were just so wild and killing Israelis for no reason. The Israelis were opening fire on Palestinian children for no reason, and that's why this action was taken. Now, Connor, my guess is that Israel just kind of was like, well, we were committing some war crimes against protesters in Gaza, so it's unfortunate, but they wouldn't do anything like collective punishment against the Palestinians in Gaza by carrying out airstrikes in the middle of Gaza City or restricting like Palestinian freedoms, would they?
Well, no, I mean, yeah, I mean, of course, it's the whole narrative is that it's like self-defense. After the I mean, this is at the end of the day, this is an open air concentration camp under blockade from the land, air, and sea. And so, yes, I mean, thousands of people came out to protest the collective punishment, the humanitarian disaster there. And somebody actually had the bravery to defend themselves, frankly, and to defend other, children in this instance. And so, but of course, Israel, they bombed Gaza that evening. In retribution, and they're saying because there's more protests planned because people some of these protests seem to be organized by Hamas. It's not as independent as previously we've seen with the Great March of Return demonstrations, but there's a group of different factions that are involved in doing these protests. And the idea is, of course, that they want to bring attention to lift the siege and to be able to rebuild after all these, after all the bombings and all the 2014 war, the assault a couple of months ago in May, and so the Israelis bombed Gaza, and they claim, as they always do, they go, oh, we're targeting weapons manufacturing facilities and tunnels and rocket launch sites. But they came out and said, yeah, we bombed sites adjacent to civilian homes and a school. So it's been ridiculous. And then the Gazans Monday morning, I'm not sure who exactly, but there were, they called them fire balloons, incendiary balloons in the media were launched over the border and started some brush fires on the other side of the border in just some open fields. And the Israelis have launched additional airstrikes this week on Gaza, again, justifying it basically under the same narrative that, oh, we're going after these, tunnels and weapons facilities and these sorts of things. And what we're seeing now is the Israeli military is telling them, in anticipation of further protests that are being planned by the Gazans, that they're supposed to get much more harsh. They're beefing up their presence along the border. They're running new drills, and it'll likely be horrific, and it'll be tons of Israeli war crimes that are committed here, because with the Great March of Return, tens of thousands of people were killed. They were shooting journalists, they were shooting medics, they were shooting disabled people in wheelchairs. So, I mean, I expect to see things like that. I mean, of course, the way the media portrays it, you're supposed to feel horrible for this essentially would-be murderer and who was shot in the head on the other side of committing a massacre, shooting all these children, but that is not that's not the way it's played up. But we're seeing now that it looks like the Gazans are not going to let up. They want to continue these protests. But what's gotten worse is, of course, now Egypt is closing the border, the Rafah crossing with Gaza, and not again. Egypt and Israel control the keep these people confined in Gaza, and there's it's 25 miles by 5 miles. There's 2 million people living in there. Half of them are children, and the Egyptians are saying essentially that they don't. I mean, the message is that they don't want these protests to go on, but these people are, these are, from what I've seen, peaceful protests. The Israelis are the ones who came out and responded to them militarily, shooting into their open air concentration camp. Right. So it's
I mean, Israel's paid, or not, excuse me, Egypt has paid a lot of money by the United States, billions of dollars a year, in aid to, be a sock puppet and essentially keep the Palestinians, particularly the ones in Gaza, relatively in line. I mean, there's only so much you could do whenever, you deprive people as much as the Israelis have deprived the people of Gaza. You are going to have people lash out violently because, look, Connor, if like your neighbor surrounded your house with guns, and you started to starve to death, at some point you do have a right to use violence to get the hell out of your house so you could go get some food. Like, people don't have a right to starve you to death. The Israelis continue to limit the amount of territory off the into the Mediterranean Sea that the Gazans could fish and get food. Whenever Gaza has a surplus of anything like tomatoes, then the Israelis prevent them from exporting them, so they have a surplus and gluts in the market, and they can't sell to their Palestinian compatriots even in the West Bank. Not to mention the Israeli response to the Palestinians try to get any COVID vaccines or anything like that, and so it's just so obvious that the people there are suffering to such an extreme degree that if their protests are met with violence, then the Israelis have just left them with absolutely no choice. Anything else on the Israel situation before we move on? I know you got some Syria news too.
Well, no, I think we essentially covered it, but it's important to keep an eye on it because, like I said, these protests will continue. The situation is of course horrible, and the Israelis are. I mean, the Bennett government is getting more violent in both the West Bank and Gaza, and so we will see probably more and more war crimes going forward.
All right. So what's happening in Syria? I heard the U.S. shot down a drone, and Biden, who, just a couple months ago was committed to keeping U.S. troops in Syria, now doesn't think there's any troops there. So what's happening here?
Yeah, but Biden came out in a meeting with George Stephanopoulos last week. And he's, in America, if you're going to end a war, you have to promise to do more intervention elsewhere. So he's been hyping up the threats ironically, from AQAP in Yemen, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, where he's escalating strikes now at the end of July and the beginning of August. And he also said that there's an increased threat in Syria. And he says, and we don't have let's see, what was the exact quote? He goes, there's a significantly greater threat to the United States from Syria, where we don't have military in Syria to make sure we're going to be protected, which is just incredible because we've been seeing reports coming out recently now, about an official under, I believe, who was remaining anonymous, had told Politico back in late July that there is no the Biden administration has no intention to reduce the military footprint in Syria, that there will be no changes. We had a top Pentagon official of the Biden administration testify to, I believe, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee recently, who said this month, he said the Biden administration is committed to retaining U.S. military presence in northeast Syria. And of course, we have 900 troops there. They're stationed mostly near where most of the oil resources that Syria has are, and they're there with the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. These are the Kurdish forces, ostensibly to to fight ISIS, but ISIS has been all but destroyed in Syria. They're mostly confined to pockets in the desert there. This is more about further crippling the Syrian economy. Of course, it's part and parcel of the economic warfare campaign there with the Caesar Act sanctions that attack their engineering and construction sectors. So then this weekend, I believe, the U.S. shot down an alleged Iranian drone. I don't know. The reporting hasn't been clear if it was, a surveillance drone or if it was an armed drone. But they said warplanes neutralized and defeated the drone, and this was over they call it the Green Village Outpost, which is near the Omar oil field. And so, it's just incredible that Biden can come out and say that. But in Daniel Larison's piece about this, he actually cited like a policy paper that came out of the Biden administration where they were actually saying, yeah, we don't have troops in Syria. This is not like the first time that this has been said by an official of this administration. So it indicates to me that they're intending to step up the presence there potentially, or just maintain the status quo. I mean, we know that for political purposes, for Mustafa al-Kadhimi, the prime minister of Iraq, and for Biden's purposes, I think with the fact that there's resistance from the Iraqi militias because of the occupation, particularly after the murder of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and Soleimani in the beginning of last year, where the parliament voted unanimously to kick the Americans out of Iraq, and we've continued to stay and continued to bomb Iraq, including these Iraqi militias who, are, at least on paper, are allies. Or were against ISIS. These are the groups largely under the Popular Mobilization Forces, different groups that used to be more or less backed by Iran. It's not so clear these days. They seem to be more independent with their own nationalist interests. But these are Shiite militias who Biden has bombed twice, I believe, in both Iraq and Syria at this point. And so, we have this continuous presence there that's provoking retaliatory attacks from Syrian forces, from Iraqi forces, that are from these militia groups. And also, it's putting Americans in harm's way. It's totally unconstitutional. We've bombed Russians in Syria, so the Russian mercenaries, I should say. So it's just incredible that Biden actually said that. We've also seen increasing attacks now all of a sudden from not all of a sudden. I mean, Israel was, for the longest time, they've been bombing Israel. Israel has been bombing Syria, I should say, on a nearly weekly basis. But it was, in the last month or so, the Russians had indicated that they wanted to see a significant drawdown in that. And so they were talking about how they were unhappy with the strikes, and they were going to, I believe, beef up the Syrian air defenses to incentivize, and basically put some pressure on Israel to not attack Syria like this. But and so for about a month, for about 27 days, Israel did not attack Syria, which is very, very rare. And then over the weekend, they bombed last week, 2 weekends ago, they bombed the southern Qantara province, which is, borders the occupied Golan Heights in Syria. And they actually dropped leaflets. Most of the time, they're attacking what they call Shiite forces. They'll say like Iran-backed, Iranian forces, basically. And it's not necessarily ever really proven, but they just call any Shiite over there an Iranian, or basically Iranian forces. But that is not that was not confirmed. Usually in this part of the country, they're bombing like Syrian army posts. But in this case, they usually don't comment on the attacks. But in this case, they actually dropped leaflets on Syrian forces, telling them essentially telling them do not align with Hezbollah, cooperate with Hezbollah. It will bring you and has brought, or they said it has brought you destruction. And they had the seal of the 210th Division, which operates out of the Golan Heights there, the occupied Golan Heights. And so then a few days later, they bombed actually a military base outside Damascus, and also homes as well, and killed I believe it was 4 Syrian soldiers. Let me confirm that. There was they killed 4 people who were identified as pro-Iranian fighters. But the Russians say that the Syrian air defenses intercepted 22 of the 24 missiles that were shot. But it looks like they've been testing Russia to see what they can get away with. And at this point, it looks like, since there hasn't been any consequences, I don't really, I've often wondered what exactly the Russians or the Syrians can actually do without provoking, a larger conflict with the Americans, as far as actually, retaliating on any level. The Syrians used to say that they would retaliate at some point in the future for all these strikes, but that's never come to pass.
Yeah. Well, eventually power dynamics can shift, Connor. So while it doesn't seem like that opportunity is there now, it doesn't mean it won't present itself at some point. But we should wrap up the show. Connor, thanks so much for coming back on and talking Afghanistan and Syria and everything with me. Everything is so important. Tell people where to find your work and where to keep an eye out for your next article.
Absolutely. All my stuff goes up at the Libertarian Institute, and you can follow me on Twitter at Freeman's Mind 96. Thanks again for having me on, Kyle.
Thanks, Connor.